Great. Well, thank you so much, Luis and colleagues, for inviting me to this. I regret that I couldn't be there in person and more importantly, couldn't hear the other talks. But I'm delighted to have this smaller chance to interact with you. I'm fascinated by the topic. I chose the title of that book, The Future of International Law, Global Government, because I really couldn't understand why people were speaking of governance and not government. And I decided to kind of put a marker down and speak of government, but I'm still not sure what the difference is. So my approach, as will be obvious immediately, is a kind of neo-functionalist, liberal internationalist approach, following some of the work of Andy Moravchik and, of course, many others. And it also partakes of the open economy politics perspective named by Lake, but applies that to law. And it's a positive theory that's based on normative individualism and individual preferences, a theory of global integration in law and in what I think is proto-government, which is international law. And so what I want to do is develop the role of international reciprocity and suggest how individual welfare through domestic politics and then international politics results in global integration in a way that you might call practical, positive subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, as you know, is often used to suggest how governmental functions might be exercised at a lower satisfactory level. But I think the better way to think about subsidiarity is not to have that bias for lower levels, but to recognize that sometimes subsidiarity suggests higher levels. And in that sense, it's a principle of efficiency. So what are the drivers of this area of integration? I don't believe, and there are people who argue about this, but I don't believe that international law evolves much on its own. Certainly, the tools that we have evolve, and as they become more complex and more capacious, we can achieve more, but the real drivers are in society through the growth of technology, globalization, democratization, economic development, and demographic change. And those are the things that I highlight in that book that Luis kindly mentioned, where I actually, in chapter 4, I go through a kind of review of the futurology literature to see what kinds of ideas people have about changes in those areas. And then in that book, I say, well, these kinds of social changes suggest a need for legal change in specified areas. And the overall idea is that there are increasing international policy externalities caused by the actions of governments or the inactions of governments. And one type of externality is a global collective action problem and other kinds of public goods problems. But of course, there's an ebb and a flow of these things, as we see in the campaign for Brexit, as we see in the United States in reactions to Trans-Pacific Partnership and even to TTIP. And of course, even the cover of the brochure for this conference has the Stop and See TTIP, which I thought was interesting that was selected. I also thought it was interesting that Germans use the English acronym for that thing, but I suppose that's another part of globalization. But There are also some areas in which, in the future, less international law will be needed and less global government will be needed. So, in that sense, it's subsidiarity. So, just to focus on one of those social change areas, it seems clear, with some bumps in the road in the early part of the 20th century and at other times, that there is a long-term trend towards globalization, and the scale and globalization of modern technology and production distinguish the recent developments and suggest greater globalization in an economic and even in a policy externality sense, with increasing importance because of these interactions, these technological and economic interactions, increasing importance of regulatory externalities. So, and what I mean by externalities in this particular context is that people in other countries care about the regulation in first countries. People in foreign countries care about home countries. And that really is the concern about global government, where the acts of governments in home countries are of concern to people in host countries. And that comprises a feedback loop between globalization and the global integration of regulatory action. So this integration, this demand for integration of regulatory action, places significant demands on international law, including more nuanced law that is state contingent, that requires nuanced conditions for its application and often requiring adjudication, as we see in the area that I study the most, the trade area, as we see in international investment law, and I think in other areas as well. So, so I think we can look at this list of crises and even opportunities as just a suggestive way of thinking about the ways in which these kinds of policy externalities and collective action problems arise. And if we look at these things, we see most of these types of issues were not of concern even 60 years ago, or certainly 100 years ago. And I took as inspiration for my work an early work by a law professor from Columbia University, Wolfgang Friedman, who spoke of the difference between the international law of coexistence, which really was not international law that had great depth. It really dealt with billiard ball states that were engaging in diplomacy as to how they would speak to one another and engage in informal types of relationships, compared to his international law of cooperation, which was a way of dealing with issues that were shared across borders between countries. And just to say a word about one of these, which is my favorite. Actually, I'll speak about two of them. But first, I want to say something about the OECD's BEPS project, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting project, where the OECD has done an enormous and compelling study that suggests that given globalization, given the ability of multinational companies to move around so actively, it's become nearly impossible for governments to carry out their taxation without much greater cooperation. And they don't come out and say this, but at some point there will have to be agreement on how to share the tax base much more specifically. And the other one I do want to mention is the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, where certainly there is practical politics here and very interesting questions about how people perceive these things, and the relationship between perception and actual distributive effects of these things. But for both of these things, the estimates of the benefits show that most of the benefits will come from regulatory cooperation. And that regulatory cooperation is likely to take the form of either harmonization or rules of choice of law, recognition rules that specify which state's law governs. And to me, that is either government or it's dividing up the government function in a way that is very important. So in light of all of these changes in the world, in light of all of these crises and opportunities, I think it is increasingly clear that domestic politics and regulation is increasingly insufficient. There are increasing coordination problems, policy externalities, collective action problems. And I think the TTIP and the TPP and the reactions to all of the things that I had on the prior slide suggest increasing recognition by governments that these things need to be addressed in cooperation with other governments. So what is the role of international law in this area? International law is simply a type of international cooperation. But as one of those types of international cooperation, it provides a linkage among domestic political systems. And this was the way in which, in that book, I suggested that international law was becoming governmental because it was carrying out and transmitting governmental functions between domestic political systems. And what international law increasingly does, and again, I come from the trade area where this is most obvious, but I believe it occurs in other areas as well, it allows states to engage in diverse reciprocity, the way national legislatures do in connection with log-rolling types of activities, to allow broader scopes of coverage, to allow transactions to take place where they would not otherwise have taken place, where they would not be Pareto efficient in the sense that somebody might not consent. But as you broaden the scope of reciprocity, the scope of potential reciprocity, you broaden the scope of possibly acceptable transactions. So you might call this way of thinking about things a kind of transactional proto-governmentality. Let me push on. So just to think about the welfarist approach here, and the idea that we're focusing on normative individualism and preferences. We start with each individual's public welfare, and then we definitely have ideational mediation where people have ideas. They constitute themselves in ways that either change their preferences or change their understanding of their position. And then that's all mediated domestically. And as I've suggested, it also has to be mediated through possible global integration. And that domestic mediation, just jumping back, can be understood through any political lens you like, but the one I've been working with is an economic, a preference-based one that focuses on public choice. So what I tried to do to think about the role of reciprocity and the role of international law in global integration is to consider that political support function and to compromise between assuming that the government is a benevolent Pigovian neoclassical actor, and the public choice model that suggests that governments are always purely self-interested and in a sense malevolent. And I followed work in the trade field by Gene Grossman and Elhanan Heltman, where they developed a model that combines campaign contributions in connection with trade and votes. And they suggest that the campaign contributions are the public choice component and the votes are the public welfare component. Obviously an oversimplification, but they get at the idea that both at least are active. And they also suggest that public decision-making, public choice indeed, must partially reflect public welfare. And it also raises important comparative politics issues. As we engage in diplomacy with different governments, we need to understand the extent to which public welfare is reflected in national decision-making. So to develop this suggestive positive theory of global integration, I start with assuming that there are opposing lobbies about a particular issue in the home state. Plus, I add a lobby that cares about something being done in a foreign state. So I'm introducing the international system to the domestic equilibrium and disturbing that domestic equilibrium with that international concern. And then a converse set up in the foreign state with a lobby that cares about some performance in the home state. And then really just to add something about the power of international law, and I hope that Shirley will speak about this in a moment. I add some modest value, again, in a public choice context, of expanding the international legal system, where international lawyers, academics are lobbying for adherence, to have more international law, to get more importance in the world, to get greater fees, to have more students, whatever the objective function is. And then in addition, government, I suggest, would be concerned about international law's systemic value in supporting a number of other types of cooperation. And so government would not be concerned about the narrow transaction alone, but would rather be concerned about having this system that provides great rewards. I also recognize, and this may be more ideational, or it could be based on preferences, that there are sovereigntist opponents, and one would have to look at particular governments, particular states' preferences for international law to estimate the value of this finger on the scale of cooperation. Second, after the moment of adherence, there's a question about compliance, and I make a second assumption, and it's just an assumption, nothing more, that after entering into international law, the lobby that supported international law, the ILS lobby, in my third bullet point, would be even more interested in ensuring compliance to protect the value of the system and government as well. So the third and fourth bullet points suggest there might be some finger on the scale towards cooperation at the moment of adherence, and maybe a slightly greater finger on the scale at the moment of compliance, purely assumptions. And then let's think about the role of reciprocity. So as I've said, I assume that the home state has a lobby that values some performance by the foreign state. Under autarky, that is not part of the equation, but after autarky, there's an opportunity for international cooperation that is, as I suggested a moment ago, an exogenous shock to the existing coalition equilibrium. And we can think about the time before international possibilities under autarky of two kinds, the time of adherence, and as I said, the time of compliance. So at the time before there's before there's an international interest, consider these two made-up situations in home state and in a foreign state. The home state has some people interested in carbon reduction and a stronger group interested in no carbon reduction. Just an assumption. And the outcome is obviously no carbon reduction. In the foreign state, just to add a distinct kind of issue, we have a group that's interested in reducing cotton subsidies and a stronger group, perhaps better organized, that wants to continue those subsidies. And the outcome is that subsidies are continued. And then at time one, I introduce international cooperation. And there are folks in the home state, in red, who are interested in reducing the cotton subsidies in the foreign state, and that interest might be enough to, under reciprocity, to join with the carbon reduction forces in the home state to overcome the otherwise stronger anti-carbon reduction folks. And also we might have some interest of government and the international law supporters that might be interested in that as well, and for their own selfish reasons, and the outcome might be carbon reduction, again, under reciprocity, where there's an exchange of actions between home state and foreign state of reducing cotton subsidies in the foreign state in exchange for reduction of carbon in the home state. And people have been speaking in the carbon setting of linking carbon reduction to trade. And so this is what you might call a microcosm of those ideas. So then at time two, I simply, as I suggested in my assumptions, assume that the only thing that changes in this table is the upwards arrows in the fourth and fifth bullet points for both of them, simply because I'm making the assumption that at the moment of compliance, both government and the international law supporters care more. So what are the implications of this theoretical perspective? If it could be tested, it would suggest that international law reciprocity might support domestic coalitions that would otherwise be unsustainable through that mechanism of exchange that I described. It can also, and this is really just saying the same thing in a different way, cause governments to internalize their policy externalities, to bear the costs through reciprocity of the things that they do that have effects on foreign people. If you buy the assumptions that I made, there would be a systematic bias towards compliance conditional on adherence because of the role of government and the international law supporters. Of course, there are lots of further issues which people in the room are more expert on than I, including issues of legitimacy, democracy, constitutionalism. There are also really interesting structural choice issues. Can these types of transactions be done through non-legal rules? What are the implications of using soft rules for these things? Is there a need for an organization? What are the functions of that organization? Should it be delegated authority, either in a legislative sense or in an adjudicative sense? What types of legislative powers should it be given? What types of dispute settlement powers should it be given? So to conclude, what I've suggested is an extension of a preference-based model of international law, adherence, and compliance into national politics in this open economy politics vein, trying to capture greater detail than some of the models of international law, adherence, and compliance that don't engage with domestic politics. It's a positive model, not a normative argument, and it is designed to predict circumstances, conditions that cause adherence and compliance. It involves the possibility of upwards or what I've called positive subsidiarity. It's a Coasian or actually even a Pigovian idea about a global governmental role for international law, bringing external effects to bear on the decisions of national governments. And importantly, global integration is dependent on identification and negotiation of efficient transnational political linkages. It's preference dependent and it's politics dependent. Under these ideas, international law extends the scope of domestic politics. It's a conveyor belt for linking different domestic politics, and that could result in integration in, as I've suggested, selected contexts. Thank you.